Okay, so I hope your intellectual perseverance is kicking in. We are at argument 4, and of course, you need to continue using all of your physiological and cognitive resources to work through an elongated, extended, challenging cognitive task, um, applying deliberately sustained effort and focus. All right, so again, I encourage you to practice bracketing and numbering statements first, and make sure you're using your notes. That's what they're there for. Any list of premise indicators and conclusion indicators you've created for yourself. And I'm going to go ahead and start to go over the results for this particular argument. So do pause the video if you want to practice, which you should. Okay, so let's look at argument 4 then. And again, I'm going to talk out loud to show you how to think through this, and I'm going to do so from the perspective of a student. Okay, so in light of the fact that the Center for Disease Control says that wearing masks slows down the spread of COVID-19, I am indeed warranted in asserting that wearing a mask does slow it down. After all, the CDC is a reliable source. And this little typo, I will fix it for Dr. Carrillo, when it comes to knowledge about the virus. I happen to like the N95 mask the most. I've bought quite a few. People have their preferences, though. Okay, so let me go. This seems like it could be some kind of indicator word. I'm going to go look at my list of premise conclusion indicators. I think I saw it maybe, or some version of that in the argument module. Okay, so I've just looked at my list, and I saw owing to the fact, so I think that in light of the fact, I saw it owing to the fact in my list of premise indicators, and this seems like it's doing the same kind of thing in light of the fact that. So I'm going to guess that this, or assume that this might be a premise indicator. So I'll go ahead and put the opening bracket right here for this statement. So the course of the statement here without the indicator phrase is the Center for Disease Control says that wearing a mask slows down the spread of COVID-19. That's a statement. Then this says, I am indeed warranted in asserting that wearing a mask slows it down. So the thought here, the claim, really what they're saying is this: wearing a mask does slow it down. Here, they're just stressing that they are drawing a conclusion. Warranted in asserting that. Okay, so warranted means that I have grounds for, which might mean I have reasons for, premises for, concluding something. So I'm thinking that this could be a conclusion, but I know for sure that this part right here is the core of the statement. Okay, after all, I think I saw after all somewhere on my premise or conclusion indicator list. I want to say it's a conclusion indicator, but I know I'm still learning how to think about arguments, statements, and indicators like a philosopher, like a logician. So I'm going to double check what I think, what I feel, what I believe with what's in the actual lesson and notes and whatnot. Wow, okay, so after all seems like it would be a conclusion indicator because of how we might use that word in everyday life, but my list and research says that this is typically a premise indicator. That's very interesting. Nonetheless, I'm focused on bracketing and numbering statements first because if I don't get that right, I might miss a premise or a conclusion. So the CDC is a reliable source when it comes to knowledge about the virus. Okay. I happen to like the N95 mask the most. That's another statement. Here's another statement. Statement 5, I've bought quite a few. Statement 6, people have their preferences though. Okay. Alrighty. Okay, so now, just quickly, I'm going to step in as your coach and professor. In the future, you're going to be analyzing the arguments that you constructed during week 2. And you might notice that there's a typo. So I actually left this typo in here. So as you can see, I forgot to include a little tiny article, the word a. If you have little tiny things like that, just like minor things, you should fix those when it comes time to analyze your own argument, because basically you're going to copy your own argument and then you're going to apply what you're learning here to your own arguments, the ones you constructed during week 2. You're not doing that right now. I'll tell you when to do that in the future. So don't worry about that. I'm just giving you a heads up that If you have minor typos or spelling issues or you forgot a word, then you can go ahead and insert a word. Okay, so I'll remind you of that later in the semester when you are applying all this to your own arguments. All right, so that said, I'm going to switch back into student mode and start labeling. All right, so I'm thinking this is a premise, and I know that this is a premise indicator. I know that these are both premise indicators. I'm really thinking that these two are premises. Now, maybe one of these are the conclusion, but I actually just did some research just to double check my feeling and opinion to make sure that I have good reasons for thinking that this might be a conclusion indicator. I am warranted in asserting that. And it turns out that this warranted is often used to say a conclusion is coming. And as I look at the phrase in which the word warranted is embedded, I am indeed warranted in asserting that. My reading comprehension skills, my remembering of what the word argument refers to in this class, my remembering of what a premise and a conclusion are, tells me that this is probably the conclusion. Now, what's interesting is that there's all these other statements. So maybe these are premises, because she said these are all simple arguments that we're working on right now. So there can only be one conclusion, and I'm fairly certain that that's the conclusion. This says, I happen to like the N95 mask. Is that doing anything logically to give support to believe that the conclusion is true? Wearing a mask does slow it down. This is about liking a particular mask. That's irrelevant to justifying the claim or getting someone to believe that wearing a mask generally slows something down. So this statement does not appear logically relevant to the conclusion, so I'm not going to label it as anything. What about this? Is this statement relevant to supporting a claim about what a mask does? Does the fact that you've bought some masks support the claim, justify as true that a mask slows down the virus? No. So I'm not going to label this as anything. And certainly nothing in here can be used or justifies this claim down here. So this certainly isn't a conclusion either, and this one isn't either. Look at this. People have their preferences though. Does this have anything to do with the main point of this paragraph, the conclusion, wearing a mask does slow it down? Contextually, 4, 5, and 6 might be contextually relevant, but they have no strictly logical role to play in terms of supporting what it is that a conclusion is saying. So this might make you think back to, this makes me think back to when she was teaching us about argument construction during week 2, and she showed us an example of statement of something that, a passage that had an argument, but it also had statements that were not relevant. So in my notes, she says, so she said, labeling statements. So I label things that are a conclusion and I label things that are a premise. So I'm going to assume that if something's not a conclusion or a premise, then of course I don't label it as anything. Okay, so let me switch into coaching mode, and I advise you to write a warning right here on this page. If a statement is, I'm on page 1, merely contextual, it has no logical role in a given argument, and should not be labeled as anything. So make sure you write this down. Pause the video if you need some time to get this down. All right, switching back into student mode. So now let me review my notes. So I'm going to try the argument diagram now, okay? So now I'm going to try to use my notes and the other examples of how to use my notes to construct an argument diagram to construct one for this one. Well, I know right away that 4, 5, and 6 will not be in my argument diagram because they don't function as anything in the argument. So I should have statements 1, 2, and 3 in my diagram. So she says I always have to label my diagram if I want the extra credit in the future. I know that my notes say I have to always start with the premises in a simple argument. I will always have premises at the top, as I would with any kind of argument. So I have to start with the S for statement, the number S1, then I put the label of the statement, premise, and it seems to be working together with statement 3. So I'm going to go ahead and put a plus sign, and then I need to find, I know that the conclusion should come last, so the next statement number I need to write is 3. She told me to underline when statements are working together, and she said I have to put the arrow directly underneath the plus sign in this case, arrow meaning given in support of, and then I should write the conclusion here, so the conclusion is statement 2. Okay, now let me review my notes for argument patterns. Okay, now I'm going to do my argument pattern in light of my notes and the other examples that I've looked at. Okay, so I have to remember not to use S here, not to use pluses, not to use arrows, just the labels. So we have a premise, dash, that is followed by a conclusion and followed by a premise. Okay, and wait a minute, didn't she say that I shouldn't have 2 premises in a pattern? Let me check my notes. She said P equals at least 1 premise. There should be only one. That's 1. There should only be 1 P when an argument has consecutive premises. Well, these premises are not consecutive. It's premise, conclusion, premise. So actually, it's okay to have 2 P's because these premises are not right next to each other in the original argument. All right, so now I'm going to work on argument 5. Okay, so you are a moron. It's not a kind thing to say, but it's definitely a statement we could argue about or in theory classify it as true or false. The Center for Disease Control is filled with quacks. That's some strong, colorful language, but it's still a statement. Everyone knows that quacks aren't reliable when it comes to knowledge. Statement 3. Hence, the CDC is unreliable. I've just about had it with all the libtards. Whoa, that is rude, but it's still a statement. A disease like no other that is ruining America. That's a sentence fragment, so I should not bracket that at all. A disease like no other that's ruining America, that's an incomplete thought. The notes tell me to bracket and number statements. And I remember in the argument module lesson that she said that a statement is a declarative sentence that makes an assertion about reality. But this isn't even a complete thought, and a statement is a complete thought, so I'm not going to bracket and number this. Talk about America. It is so sad what is going on with our country today. This is kind of weird, but I can see that there's definitely complete thought in here, so I'll go ahead and bracket that. 6. What's happening to America? Ooh, this is a question, not a statement, so I'm not going to bracket it or number it. Okay. All right, so now I'm going to go ahead and label premises, any premises, and the conclusion. I remember, oh yeah, right here, hence, that stuck out to me really big time. And on my list that I'm looking at right now, I can see that hence typically functions as a conclusion indicator. And when I look at some of the other statements, it seems like this would be something that they're trying to argue for. So I'm going to put C for conclusion. They're trying to argue, convince the reader or the listener that the CDC is unreliable. So what are they giving in support of that? That has a logical role to play, even if it's in colorful language. So the Center for Disease Control is filled with quacks. So if it's colorful language, maybe what they mean is people who are not reliable. So I'm going to say that's their premise, very kind of colorfully stated. Everyone knows that quacks aren't reliable when it comes to knowledge. So whatever they mean by quacks, it seems like they're using this as a premise in support of their conclusion. This has no logical role to play toward the conclusion. You are a moron, that's just name calling. How does this prove that the CDC is unreliable? This doesn't even say anything about the CDC or reliability, so there's no way that it can be used to support this conclusion. It has nothing to do with it. And not only that, but this statement doesn't have anything to do with any of the premises. There's nothing, there's no wording or ideas expressed in the premises that are expressed in here. This is just name calling, so I'm not going to label that as anything. Here, they say, I've just about had it with all the libtards. Oh, forgot the closing bracket. So, well, what is that all about? That has nothing to do with trying to prove that the CDC is unreliable. Neither does this. I kept forgetting my closing brackets, guys. Don't forget to do your closing brackets. Talk about America, it's so sad what is going on in our country. Again, what does that have to do with proving the CDC is unreliable? That's nothing. So out of all this colorful language and statements and rhetoric, only 2 and 3 and 4 are functioning as anything in this argument. All right, so I'm going to try the argument diagram. So I've basically got S2, a premise, plus S3, another premise, being given in support of S4, the conclusion. Well, there's 3 statements in here that aren't even in here. And there's a whole sentence that's not in here at all as well. Okay, so the argument pattern is a premise, conclusion. Let me check my notes and make sure that's right, because I feel like that's wrong. There should be only one P when an argument has consecutive premises. Whoa, whoa, whoa. This has consecutive premises. She said there should only be one P when I have consecutive premises. So the answer is this. Okay. All right, so students, I'm going to break out into coaching mode because there are some very important lessons and points that I need to make here, and I want to make sure that we cover them. So one of them has to do with this word after all, right here. So I want you to add to your warnings here, I want you to write after all on page 5. Sorry, my handwriting is horrible. After all, okay. Let me see if I can adjust this. Give me a second. Okay, so after all, my eraser's not working, which is why you see me scratching things out. After all. Okay, I think this is as good as it's going to get. After all is always a premise indicator. In a statement that is actually functioning in some way, I should say, as part of an argument. So if you need to, pause the video before we continue because I'm going to make another point. So I could say, after all has been said and done, I am going to the store. So in that sentence, after all may not be a premise indicator, but all I gave you was the sentence. It's not an argument. All I'm saying is that if a statement is part of an argument and you see the word after all, it's going to be a premise indicator. In any case, what I really, really want to stress is never interpret this. Maybe it'd be better for me to say this. Never interpret this word as a conclusion indicator. Okay, so that's an important point that I wanted to bring up. What about, was there anything else here that I wanted to bring up? I'm going to tell you, I'm going to have you do something else with irrelevant statements, but that's going to be after you get a new argument analysis lesson. Here you can see that there is a lot of rude and disrespectful language in here. As you can see, in using this language, they're not building bridges of understanding, they're building walls of intolerance. And so it's like this is a very disrespectful way to present your argument and to engage in an argument. If you want people to listen to you, I mean, maybe you have good reasons for thinking the CDC is unreliable. But how you present your argument, the way you treat another human being in trying to make your point matters. So we've got to be respectful and use proper reasoning and not resort to rhetorical elements in name calling. Unfortunately, we see that way too much in social media and even by supposed leaders in our society. And I think that that is sad. So we'll talk about what are called rhetorical elements and this colorful language stuff in a future lesson after you do your second argument module. I think that's all I want to say about that. But remember, I'm giving you examples of arguments that you can find in real life. So some people really do speak to other people this way in writing and social media, uh, to news agencies, to reporters during press conferences, to each other in person. So I'm giving you the real world examples, or examples that you would find in the real world, even when they seem disrespectful and rude, and even if the position seems extreme. I'm going to give you the real stuff.